guys, it's Jackie. Welcome back to my channel. So this video is really long overdue, I think. So if you guys have been watching the videos I've been posting recently, you'll know that the month of February didn't go exactly as hoped, or at least it was an extremely eventful month. I passed my PhD qualifying exam, so that's very exciting. I'm now a PhD candidate. I took a very protracted trip to California. I came down with a very strange respiratory viral infection that I'm still kind of trying to fight off. That is not COVID-19 apparently, but is really just exhausting me a lot. And COVID-19 happened, so just all of the hullabaloo about, self-isolation, and I work for a university, and moving that university online has been a very interesting transition. So it's been a weird couple of months, basically, is what I'm saying. The last 60 days have been really strange. And as such, I haven't had a lot of time to do reading, unfortunately, which is why the wrap-up I'm doing now should have been done at the end of February, but I was not able to complete this reading challenge over the course of February. And that reading challenge is Blackathon, which is obviously a challenge that is intended for February because it's Black History Month here in the United States. And again, things just kind of got away from me, but all that while I was slowly able to make my way through my reading list of the books I had chosen for the prompts, and I really enjoyed them, so I still wanted to do a Blackathon wrap-up, even if it's, the end of March. If you remember, if you'll come with me back on a journey back 2 months ago to when I originally posted my TBR for this challenge, I decided to be Team SFF. You could have been either Team Contemporary or Team SFF, which was, sci-fi fantasy. I, of course, opted for the sci-fi fantasy route just because I had a lot of Black Voices books on my TBR already that were SFF, and so the prompts just really worked for me. And a couple of these books were books that were on my dissertation TBR, including the first one, the Gilda Stories by Jewel Gomez. So Gilda is the book that I chose for the prompt. It was the Janelle Monáe, which was an LGBTQIA Black SFF novel, which, if you're not familiar with Gilda, and again, I feel like this is the book that prompted the most interest out of my TBR video just because it was such an uncommon book or an unheard of book. And again, like I said in that video, it's a book I feel like even a lot of scholars who work with vampire literature aren't that familiar with, especially scholars my age. Again, people who have been working in the field a lot longer than I have. They have some kind of maybe like cursory familiarity with it. The Gilda Stories is very interesting because it is an early 1990s sapphic Black vampire story about an unnamed heroine who escapes from slavery only to find herself in the home of this mysterious white woman and her companions in Louisiana, and of course that white woman ends up being a vampire, and our unnamed heroine becomes part of this coven, and then the book then follows her over the decades and just like her life and her experiences meeting other vampires like her, but also forming a kind of like queer found family. Because this one was on my dissertation TBR because my dissertation is very much about like metaphors of monsters as queer, queerness being encoded as monstrosity, which is something that when Jewel Gomez was writing in the early 90s was pretty typical. The early 90s were quite interesting for horror and gothic fiction because there was what Jack Halberstam would call postmodern Gothic, that there was this kind of reversal in that period of a kind of reconsideration of the monster as a figure and who we as viewers or readers should have sympathy for in these monster stories. The example I always use to teach my students is Disney's Beauty and the Beast, right? That like the Beast is our hero, and Gaston, who is, that's kind of hegemonically, that he's hyper masculine, he's popular, he's, really well loved as a kind of upstanding citizen of hegemonic masculinity, that he becomes our villain, our monster hunter. And Halberstam invites us that, maybe we should reconsider and think that maybe the monster hunter is actually the villain. which I think is something that now, you know, 30 years out, resonates with us, right? That monsters have a kind of, let's say, a varied life in our cultural imaginary, that it's not just as simple as that monsters are always the bad guys, right? And that was something that Gomez talks about, because this is a 25th anniversary edition. She has a really interesting foreword in it where she talks about that she was inspired to write this book when she was catcalled and harassed by two men on the streets of New York one night, and her response was that she just started screeching at them like a banshee, just screaming at them, and it frightened the men off. And she immediately wanted to just write a story about, you know, what it is to be a woman and have some kind of outlet to channel this very kind of real rage. Because she talks about in that moment that she felt such intense, violent rage that she didn't really know what to do with, and that made her really uncomfortable. And that's definitely something that monsters have been useful for marginalized groups of people, certainly for women, certainly for people of color, certainly for queer individuals. And Joel Gomez is, you know, all of those things. It's a very intersectional take. And that she really wanted there to be some kind of like catharsis, and like, again, a reconsideration of the vampire as a figure, because typically the vampire, right, in the Western imaginary is an aristocratic figure. It's certainly since, you know, Dracula, and even earlier than that, like John Polidori with the vampire in the 1810s, that usually the vampire represents some kind of like hegemonic, like class structure. They're usually the aristocrats. And in the case of Dracula, right, he becomes like the old world aristocracy, which is put in direct opposition to like the much more democratic English, which, again, I could literally rant about like Bram Stoker's very complicated relationship with class and xenophobia all day, but I won't. Anyway, the point is that like, usually vampires represent like the oppressor, not the oppressed. And Joel Gomez was interested in kind of inverting that. And she talks about that even her friends showed a lot of resistance to that when she was talking about like, I want to have a Black lesbian vampire. They were like, that seems really problematic. Which is something I'm always dealing with in my own dissertation. So I really enjoyed this. It's a very unusual book, which I kind of expected. It has this very kind of, if you're familiar at all with any kind of, especially African-American women's literature in the 1980s and the early 90s, this almost sort of, it's not stream of consciousness exactly, but it has this very kind of like, rich, dense, dreamlike quality to the prose. And I mean, that was very deliberate. Like, the person who comes to mind whose work really kind of embodies this the most is probably Toni Morrison. And it's deliberately trying to evoke a kind of shared collective unconsciousness of like this like shared African-American unconsciousness. And its effects are usually really hypnotic and dreamlike and verging on stream of consciousness. And that's definitely how this feels. And again, it's playing with temporality a lot, like Gilda and her group, like we as a narrative, we're jumping around like decades later. You'll turn the page and now we're suddenly decades later. And very interestingly, something I was not expecting in this is that this was written in 93, and there is a section that takes place in 2020, which was really interesting, because like there's stuff in it that it's like, we do have that. Like there's like something like an analog to like email and like an analog to like Skyping in this, but then like she'll watch something on a VHS tape and suddenly you'll be jarred back to like, oh, this was written in 93. And there is a kind of post-apocalyptic vision of like 2050, which was very interesting. If you're interested in reading it, again, like I said, the prose is very unusual. It is strange. If you like Carmilla, you will be interested in this, I think. There were several moments in this book that were deliberately evocative of Carmilla, the Victorian novel and later YouTube web series. If you like Toni Morrison's Beloved, you will probably like this. If you like Interview with a Vampire, you will probably like this. So I recommend it. I thought it was super interesting. I gave it, I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. It wasn't like an ultimate love, but it was very, very good. The next book that I read was for, I'm reading the prompts here, was the prompt for Nnedi Okorafor, a work of Afrofuturism centering a complex and advanced society, which I had a lot of different books to choose from, but the one that I chose for the Afrofuturism prompt was Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, because I have been meaning to read this forever. I really liked it. I liked this so much, and I'm so glad it's that most rare and beautiful of creatures, which is a high fantasy that I really, really liked. This was very, very fascinating to me. Children of Blood and Bone is the first book in the Legacy of Orisha series. It's very much... I've seen people compare it to Harry Potter so much, which always really bothers me because they did the same thing with Akata Witch and a lot of works of, you know, Afrofuturism and Black fantasy that came out in the last like 10 years or so. And I think that that's just so, I just find that aggravating to compare like every YA fantasy to Harry Potter anyway, especially because like, this doesn't really feel like Harry Potter to me. Interestingly enough, and this is something I found out after I was reading it, while I was reading it, what it reminded me most of was Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I learned after reading it, that's because Tomi Adeyemi is an Avatar: The Last Airbender fan, which makes so much sense because Zayli and Anan, they sure are just Zutara, which is a ship from Avatar that I did not ship. However, I think made a lot more narrative sense. And I'm just going to leave it at that. You know, some shows where it's like, it's not even that I actively ship this. I just recognize that this does make more narrative sense and is more narratively rich. That's my feelings about Zuko and Katara. And that is absolutely the relationship in Children of Blood and Bone, which is about Orisha, which is this world in which there was magic and there were individuals, the Magi, who could do magic, and then suddenly the magic vanishes and disappears and leaves all of these Magi kind of disempowered. And while they're disempowered, this evil king decides, like, I'm going to just commit a mass genocide and I'm going to wipe them out because if their power ever comes back, they're too powerful. They need to be done away with. And the surviving people who like managed to make it out of the purge unscathed, or the children of the Magi who were murdered in that purge, are now treated very much as like third-class citizens. So it feels very much, it's very much about institutionalized racism and apartheid, which was very interesting and just upsetting and dark. This book is so complex and so interesting and does such a skillful job of meditating on things like institutional racism and abuses of power and revenge, and the question of like, you know, are the Magi overpowered? Is that ethical for them to have this kind of power? Which is something that like Avatar: The Last Airbender didn't really deal with until like Legends of Korra. Which those are all really interesting questions. And this book, I loved this book. But anyway, so our plot focuses on Zayli, who is the child of a Magi, who has the opportunity that like there is maybe a way to bring magic back, which would, you know, kind of liberate the Magi from out from underneath this this diabolical regime under the hand of this merciless king who hates the Magi and wants them all to be exterminated. And he sends his son, our Prince Zuko for the evening, Anan, out to try to stop her. And of course they fall in love, some good old enemies to lovers that like, here I really like well done enemies to lovers. I like enemies to lovers with a male antagonist who again was raised in a really abusive system and is genuinely conflicted because he's torn between like what he is learning and knows to be right and ethical versus what his father has taught him and like love for his father and family and duty. And as Zuko would say, my honor. So that was very interesting. I do enjoy enemies to lovers when it's that. Again, when the male antagonist actually has a reason to be conflicted instead of just like, I don't know, like some weird shadow emperor got in my head, so I like murdered my dad for some reason, unclear, doesn't matter. I always hate that, but this was really great. It's such a dense book, however, like it's so thick, but you fly through it. Like I read this in like, I think 2 short sittings within like the span of like 24 hours. I just like devoured it. I really want to read the sequel now because, oh, this was so good. I just like all the characters. I think that the world is very well developed. I think that, again, like I said, the ethical issues at stake here are very well handled in a very kind of meditative and mature way, that all of the shades of gray are addressed in a way that, you know, often in YA high fantasy and high fantasy in general, it's always just like this strict, like, you know, good versus evil in these very kind of black and white terms. And this is much more interested in, you know, like, that it's not always that simple. That it's not always that easy, in a way that, again, I can understand why Tomi Adeyemi likes Avatar: The Last Airbender, because Avatar: The Last Airbender did that too with the Fire Nation, that the Fire Nation is made up of human beings, right? That they feel like this evil big bad, but then ultimately become humanized by the end of this series. So this was really great. Highly recommended if you have not checked it out. Again, I feel like most of Booktube has probably read this book. I'm really last to the gate. I will be picking up the sequel as soon as possible, because just the ending, anyway, I'm just like, I really need more resolution than this. But very, very good. Gave this one 5 stars. My next one, the next prompt was David F. Walker, an SFF comic or graphic novel by a black author with a black protagonist. So for this, I read a mini-series that I've been meaning to read for a while, which was Black Panther: World of Wakanda, which was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates and Roxane Gay. So this was very interesting because it focused on one of the things that I do like the best about the world of Black Panther and Wakanda, which is the Dora Milaje. It's about 2 women, Ayo and Anika, who are training to become Dora Milaje, which, if you're unfamiliar with Black Panther, the Dora Milaje are this elite class of female warriors who become like bodyguards for the royal family. And they swear to, you know, defend Wakanda and the royal family with their lives. And something really great happens, which is that they fall in love with each other, and that's always really fun. Which always, again, anytime that it's like, oh, there's like this coven of women, and like our duty is to, like, you know, protect and possibly even marry someday our king T'Challa, and it's like, yeah, well, we fell in love with each other, so anyway. And there's a lot of drama because Ayo is more of a kind of free agent, she's more independent, and Anika is much more traditional and dedicated to the Dora Milaje, and so there is conflict in their relationship where Anika doesn't really want to be out about their relationship, whereas Ayo does. And so all of that I really enjoyed. The thing I struggled with this comic, which is just, it's not that it's poorly written, it's really well written, I enjoyed this a lot, it's just that plot in Marvel Comics, for me sometimes, I have such a hard time, not even following, I don't feel invested. I don't think it's a huge secret with people who know me. I don't know if I've talked about it that much on the channel, but like, I'm a DC girl more than I am a Marvel girl, because I love the villains, I love the gothic fantasy of it all. And Marvel is, it's less of that, right? That the plots are much more kind of militaristic, less emphasis on villains. Black Panther does have excellent villains. It's kind of like the X-Men in that regard. Like, the best villains in Marvel can usually be found in the X-Men in the world of Black Panther. And the villains in this are very interesting. But the plots just get away from me, where I was invested anytime it was Ayo and Anika and their plot, and then anytime it was about, you know, T'Challa and like what he was doing, and I just don't care. And that just goes for all of Marvel Comics. I just don't care, you guys. And I know that's terrible. I know people love Marvel so much, and I don't care, like, at all. It sucks. Because if you like comics and you don't like Marvel Comics right now, that's kind of difficult. Which, granted, if you like comics and you like DC Comics, that is an eternal struggle, just because, like, nobody hates comics more than comics fans, if you know what I'm talking about. Because both the big houses have their problems. But Marvel just kind of, like, the plots just kind of have a hard time holding my attention, that was true here. And one other thing, which is, this is definitely a criticism this comic has gotten before, which is that it is so text heavy. It is so prosy, which, it's not that the prose is bad, obviously not. It's Ta-Nehisi Coates and Roxane Gay, so the prose is great. It's just that, like, comics as a medium are a visual medium, you know, that is the mode of storytelling here. And so for comics to be very, very text heavy, it can weigh them down. And this is very text heavy in places. So, and again, that's nitpicking. I really enjoyed this a lot. I do like Ayo and Anika. I thought they were very interesting. And again, it's a comic focusing on one of my favorite parts of Marvel, which is the Dora Milaje. So I gave this one 4 stars. All right, the next one, Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. I read for the Danielle Clayton prompt, an SFF book with a cunning and ambitious Black protagonist, excuse me, and Jane in this book is certainly that. This was one that, I don't know, I had a weird time reading this book. I both did not enjoy it as much as I thought I would, in general, but then there were elements of it I did enjoy a lot more than I thought I would. So if you're unfamiliar with Dread Nation, this is a kind of historical alternate universe in which during the Civil War, the dead begin rising. We have a zombie outbreak in the United States, and it becomes a situation where the United States starts opening these boarding schools where young Black women and Native American women and other undesirable young people are being raised to become bodyguards and assassins to protect wealthy white people. And it's very conscious of the fact, Justina Ireland has talked explicitly about the fact that this is very loosely based on things like Indian boarding schools, which were real institutions that existed that were, you know, basically a form of cultural genocide where young Native students were sent and stripped of their culture and beaten for speaking their languages and turned into, you know, these kind of instruments of American society, just like forcibly integrated into this American society against their wills, which is an act of cultural genocide, like I said. So it's conscious of that. Something that really delighted me about it, because this follows Jane, one of the students at these boarding schools, who is a young Black woman, I think in her late teens, 18, 19, is that the first half of this book especially is so genre savvy of like 19th century Bildungsroman school story narratives, that this feels at once like it's very accurate to the genre of like 19th century school stories without being too in love with its own verbosity, so you get kind of weighed down. That there is a really nice balance struck here between like that this authentically feels like a 19th century narrative. However, it is still contemporary enough to be accessible and fun and not plotting. And I'm saying that as someone who reads 19th century novels for fun. They can be kind of a challenge. And this strikes a really good balance between that. And I liked it very much. I liked Jane as a protagonist. I liked a lot of the secondary characters. I wish some of them had been better developed. My biggest complaint with this one was that once we start off in the space of like the East Coast boarding school where Jane and her companions are being trained as assassins, and then the plot kind of necessitates that they are forcibly moved out to the Wild West. And once that move happens, for me, I don't know, the plot got a little muddier. It got a little more loosey-goosey and just not as tight, not as interesting for me. There is going to be a sequel to this. I don't think I'm going to pick it up and read it, just because like at the end of this I felt kind of like satisfied, even though there is a very open-ended sequel bait kind of resolution here. But I just kind of found the first half of this book a lot more interesting than its second half, which it's fine. I still gave it 4 stars. I did like it, but I didn't love it as much as I thought I would, which, you know, again, I'm a big horror gal. Zombies are usually my least favorite monster just because they don't have personalities. And I don't know, the period when I was first finding my interest as like, you know, like as a monster scholar and as somebody who wanted to write about horror and monstrosity for a living, like there was such a glut of zombies. Like this was like the mid-2000s and just everything was zombies, and understandably, right? Because, you know, Contagion scares us. Hi 2020. But zombies just usually really bore me. This was interesting and well done. Another historical aspect that this does pick up on that I thought was really smart, like a smart choice to include, was you know, experiments being done to try to find a cure for this zombieism, where like slaves and freedmen against their will, Black freedmen against their will, are being used in these experiments by like white scientists, you know, deliberately exposed to the contagion, and otherwise experimented on in really horrible ways, which is also something that is true of United States history, that is really important to remember, of just how much of the US's scientific and medical advancement comes from experiments done on unwilling Black bodies, done and performed on slaves. So that was also something that I thought was very intelligent. I mean, it was good. Again, that's why the first half of the book I just think is like such a, again, an interesting meditation on U.S. history and like the metaphors here. They just work so immaculately. And then the second half gets a little bit more, it's not generic YA, because I certainly have never read a plot like it, but it's just kind of like, I don't know, less interesting for me, which maybe not for you. And then the last book I want to talk about is The Dark Fantastic by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, which this wasn't for a prompt. This was just an extra bonus book that I threw in because I really wanted to read it, and look how beautiful it is. Its cover is stunning. This was a book that was published last year, was very eagerly anticipated, certainly in the academic circles that I run in, especially because at my university, our department we were all eagerly anticipating this book because Dr. Thomas did come and give a talk on Blackness and fantasy and fandom, and it was just so excellent. Like, Dr. Thomas is just really so brilliant, overwhelmingly brilliant, and really brave and amazing, the way that most African American scholars in this period really are, because they're out here really fighting the good fight, you know, doing critical race theory, talking about representation, even though they're, you know, having their Twitters doxxed by neo-Nazis all the time. That's a thing that academics have to deal with now. And Dr. Thomas has certainly had her fair share of Twitter attacks. This is a book, it's an academic monograph, so it is literary analysis, and its subtitle is Race and the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. And this was Dr. Thomas's book on representations of Blackness in YA and popular fandoms from the last about 10 years or so. And the way that Blackness is represented, especially the way that Black women are represented. And there's several different chapters here, and it was just, it hit me right in my fandom feels, because this is exactly the period of fandom that I'm most familiar with and that I am typically working with, because it's the period of fandom when I was in fandom so heavily. There is a chapter on the Hunger Games and Rue, which was really excellent. I'm probably going to be teaching the Hunger Games in fall. I'm doing a class on Lit for the Adolescents, and I want to kind of revisit the Hunger Games and Rue's death specifically. And I think I'll probably teach alongside like The Hate You Give and a number of other books. So that was really useful for me. There was a chapter about Gwen in BBC's Merlin, which really took me back and made me really happy. A chapter on Bonnie Bennett in The Vampire Diaries. And then finally a chapter which is the most kind of contemporary case study, which was about Black Hermione and Harry Potter fan art and fans race-bending fan art, and the kind of interesting case study that has become, since we have, you know, Black actresses playing Hermione on stage now, and J.K. Rowling wants to kind of pat herself on the back for something that she did not do, which what else is new? Anyway, I'm just meditating. My next video is going to be very Harry Potter heavy, so I'm thinking about it already. Again, this was really brilliant. If you are interested in fandom, not even as an academic, I feel like the price on this monograph is pretty reasonable. I feel like it runs like $25 or $30, which I know is pretty expensive in general, but for an academic monograph, that is nothing. Monographs are usually like, they get stupidly expensive, like $90 for a hardback, you know, because academia's biggest problem is accessibility. But this one is very accessible. It's accessibly written. It's accessibly available. If you're interested in fandom, it is fascinating. If you're interested in Blackness and the ways in which Blackness is represented in fandom, the ways in which Black fans interact with fandom and interact with certain characters, then I highly recommend this. And she's just lovely too. So support her. She's a brilliant and such a wonderful woman. And I cannot say enough good things about this book. And its cover is so beautiful. I can't get over how much I love this cover. Again, sometimes academic monographs are very ugly and expensive, and this one is beautiful and, again, affordable. She said as a very, very broke academic herself, where coming by academic monographs for cheap is not easy. But this one was deliberately made more affordable by NYU because there was, I think, an understanding that this would have like widespread appeal. Just because we're living in a moment where, again, fandom is, I think fandom has boomed. I think fandom is not winding down exactly. Just the nature of it has changed a lot in the last couple of years. But there is such a more conscious, I've said meditation in this video so many times, but there's more of a conscious meditation on fandom and what fandom is and how fandom politics work, which I think is why fandom has kind of changed, that there's just so much kind of more like introspection in like inculcated into the whole thing. And fandom is just so much more mainstream right now that I think NYU knew that this would maybe be of some interest, especially with things like, you know, we need diverse books and own voices and other things like that trending, that this would be an interesting book. And it is. I love it so much. I will probably be teaching the chapter about Rue in my class in the fall, which I just found out I'm teaching Lit for Adolescents in the fall, so my head is spinning with ideas, so I'm very excited. All right, so that was my February / March / Blackathon wrap up. It's a month late, but you know, we're all just doing our best right now. Again, really enjoyed everything. Again, the lowest ratings were like 4 stars. And again, even a lot of the criticisms I have about them is kind of nitpicking, really. I highly recommend any of these. Again, Blackathon is a wonderful challenge. I highly recommend doing it every February. I also just, you know, recommend including more Black voices in your TBR. It's super enriching and fascinating. And again, there is such fascinating and rich work being done right now in YA, in sci-fi fantasy, and in contemporary by Black authors. And we just live in such an exciting moment for publishing, honestly, where these kinds of stories are getting more traction. It's not enough, but it's just the difference now versus 5 years ago, 10 years ago is kind of mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling to me, honestly. So anyway, I'm going to be seeing you guys again very shortly with my TBR for next month. I'm doing another reading challenge, which is going to be the Book Roasts OWL Magical Readathon, which I do every year, but this is the first year I've had a Booktube channel to record it. So stay tuned for that. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.